Hi all, it's really funny to be talking about A Tale of Two Cities, Santo Domingo and New York after 1950 from Jesse Hoffnung-Garskof. Being here, far from you, exactly because I'm a person that belongs to a transnational social space, or not. So I'm here and I hope it's okay for you to listen to this video. In A Tale of Two Cities, the author tells us a story of a large phenomena that englobes concepts of cities, immigration, race, ethnicity, but has a lot to do with local interactions too. An important idea for that is to consider that the notion of a Dominican self always had a lot to do with the U.S. as the other, that rested itself on the idea of imperialism and intervention. That's why I think this book dialogues with almost everything we have read. With Berger, when he talks about the construction of Latin American through a North American point of view, with Mignolo talking about the idea of Latin America related directly with the idea of Hispanicos present in this book, with Jose Moya, of course, that talks a lot about immigration, but there's a difference because Dominicans didn't come from the boat, as he says about Argentinians, and we'll see that later. With Amy Cheskel, when it comes to racial aspects and the way Dominicans face race, it's very similar to the way that she shows Brazilians faced it during Jogo do Bicho phenomenons. 1965 is considered by many as the turning point on Dominican immigration to the U.S., not only because of changes in immigration law, but because of the American invasion to the Dominican Republic. It makes this case unique. On chapter 1, he treats more of the relations between the city and the countryside in Dominican Republic, the urbanization of Santo Domingo at speeds in 1950s. People from the countryside migrate to the urban area of Santo Domingo, but he also mentions historical facts that are very important for the history of the two countries. On 1870, the U.S. almost annexed the nascent republic. In 1916, the Marines invaded Santo Domingo and governed the Dominican Republic for the next 80 years. The U.S. supports Trujillo 4 years after his death, invades the country again. So the creation of a Dominican identity has a lot to do with comparisons to the U.S., especially with New York, where the Dominican sugar went to market and where the manufactured goods were shipped to the Dominican Republic. My question is, to what point this influences the nation, the birth of this new identity? He mentions gender and family practices. I remember one book from Robert Smith called Mexican New York Transnational Lives of New Immigrants, and he talks a lot about this change of the Latino macho idea when people from Tijuana, a small village in Mexico, move to New York, and when they go back to Tijuana, they don't know anymore if they still have that Latino macho idea of, or if they are already adapted to New York. He also talks about the racial question. Many described the raza as Dominican, despite the color of the skin. And he introduced the concept of progreso, an idea of historical change, and cultura, a way of thinking about belonging. Those are concepts very important during the entire book, and that later will be used to justify government, define identities, or simply to explain infrastructural changes. On the second chapter, he talks about the colonial period, and for the author, the moment after the independence from Haiti is when the nationalism arises, and is also very connected to idea of progreso and cultura. He also writes a lot about the government of Trujillo, of course, because he spends 31 years in the power, but also because this is a very particular moment of Dominican history when there's a big shift from rural to a more urban area. After Trujillo's death, Kennedy administration quickly stepped in and with the New Deal ideology. He also mentions that. And I'll jump to chapter 3, where the author makes a tale of two barrios, El Caliche and Cristo Rey. And when he talks about these areas, he mentions many large phenomena and also reasons that could explain migration movements as economical reasons and the fact that people are seeking better lives, the structures of political domination. But there's also one factor that he mentions, during the entire book, that Saskia Saskin identifies as a kind of spark. And this is something that we can also notice in some moments of the book. On chapter 4, He now tries to understand the immigration from Santo Domingo to New York after understanding the immigration from rural areas to urban areas from Santo Domingo to New York. The most interesting aspect is the influence of the United States even during the invasion. Yes, the country is seen as an enemy by many with an imperialist posture of domination, but there's no way to deny its influence, and this can be seen as a first step for this fascination for this new country, for this spark. The first waves of immigration happened much before the law reform, after the death of Trujillo. He talks also about how hard it was to have a passport in Dominican Republic. It was really expensive and few were issued, and the reasons were the underpopulation, the Dominican Republic, the belief that the country was underpopulated, and also the control of the passports could be a way to assure support to the regime. After Trujillo death, there are riots complaining, Dominicans complaining during the intervention of the U.S. So this new wave of migration starts to happen. This is deeply related to the concepts of progreso and cultura. It is also important to notice that Dominicans often relate to this movement as cultural struggles. But the most important questions in this chapter are race and ethnicity, as we can see also in chapter 5 and 6. On chapter 5, he deals with the idea of Hispanic. This is really interesting because during the period of the solidification of a Dominican identity in New York, there are many phases: denying they were black, being partners with blacks, differentiating from Puerto Ricans, and understanding themselves as Hispanic. So this is really interesting to observe how those moments are making them answer the question, what are Dominicans? It's a really tough question, really hard to answer. On chapter 6, he focuses on George Washington High School. Again, local history, trying to understand the larger phenomenon. And there's a statement that summarizes the reason for this alliance with black Puerto Ricans, even though it didn't work earlier. These were kids, some with checkered academic records, demanding the right to middle-class aspirations. In short, school represented a tool for progreso. So in chapter 6, he talks about this biggest challenge of immigrants: creating an identity, blamed for not belonging to New York, not assimilating American culture, and at the same time blamed for forgetting Santo Domingo. It has a lot to do with my interest, so it's really important to understand this through this way. He mentions economic factors, remittances, social factors, the role of family for Dominicans and the difficulty to keep it, and how people wanted to be painted in Santo Domingo. So it seems to me that there's always a wrong impression. They're rich or they're drug dealers. They have successful histories of bodegas, tales of progreso. 40% of the community, on the other hand, are under poverty line, so tales of failure, and cocaine sellers, tales of corruption. So it's important to emphasize that all those cases, bad or good, can be seen as cases of people who intend to progresar. He mentions the influence of the press on this process, and we can associate this to Pablo Picato papers and how the construction of those myths about migrants happen according to the media coverage. Then he gets back to the important idea of transnational ties. In a world where things change so fast, migrants could belong permanently to two communities. But for all we have seen in the book, this seems to me really impossible. What we see happening is the creation of a third mixed identity with some aspects of both communities. This is the transnational social space. On chapter 8, he deals with the period from the withdrawal of the U.S. troops in 1966 to the democratic elections in 1978, related to race, and again he dives on local subjects, community and barrios politics, to understand the population as a whole. He talks about Travoltismo, Michael Jackson and its influences in Dominican barrios, and spaces and cities as symbols for the experience of modern life in a country moving from rural to urban majority. Now I'll jump to Ramon Saldivar, and it has a lot to do with this idea when he talks about the creation of a new Mexicano identity. Americo Paredes, the poet, deals with the idea of language and songs as fundamental to develop a culture, to develop an identity. I also remember Fernando Pessoa, the Portuguese poet, who says that my homeland is my language. It's a cultural nationalism. It's curious that he talks about poets, songs, and culture. This is also present every moment in Tale of Two Cities. Paredes proposes a cultural revolution by rejecting European influence and creating a Mexican identity on music and poems. On the other hand, we can see how hard it is to detach for him from the influence of English. Even though he writes in Spanish a few poems, these bilingual poems are an example of this difficulty. He talks about rivers as a metaphor for the course of life. Rivers are spaces and temporalities, are histories and concretized social spaces, and have a lot to do with power. Paredes is one of those actors with this permanent conflict of belonging. At one time he's Mexican, at other time he's a Yankee. Paredes is contributing to a new world counter discourse of modernity emerging in Americas and the Caribbean, according to the author. The modern poem for Paredes would have to be racially indeterminate, transnational, and diasporic. So it raises lots of questions. Has this new world arrived, or is it more distant? To what point culture is determinant to create identity? To what point space influences the creation of community identities? Well, that's it. I hope it was not too much. Thanks for sharing this video conference moment with me. Bye bye, and hope to see you soon.